Hello, everyone. I am Anthropomantic Fiend. I do horror related things on the internet, and today I have a video for you that I've been meaning to do for a little bit now. If you follow me on social media, you may have seen that back in November, shortly before my Thanksgiving break, I received this from a friend, that friend being the author of the book. This is Arkham Anonymous. It is by Antoinette Cancelliere, or Annie Cancelliere, and I first discovered her stuff through the horror YouTube community, the same way I discovered a lot of the people that inspired me to start my channel in the first place, which was through the creepy channel crawl that the Horror Addicts were hosting back in summer of 2019. And I was already following Horror Addicts, but I wasn't really following anyone else that was on that crawl besides the horror show at the time. So I found a lot of people who I am now friends with through that. I wasn't actually there for Annie's live segments in person, but I did end up rewatching a bunch of those live streams afterwards, and that's how I discovered those people. Annie is one of the people who inspired me to start doing this in the first place. She is a horror content creator, horror critic, trans girl, and now an author. I believe she mailed this out to me shortly before I started college this past year, so towards the end of the summer. And then it didn't arrive until sometime around November. I didn't finish it until early last month, and I didn't get a chance to film a review for it until now because life is hectic that way. I don't even know when this will be coming out. With any luck, it'll be sometime within the next 2 months, but I should really, given how long it has taken for this to happen, stop stalling. So without further ado, this is my review of Arkham Anonymous by Annie Cancelliere. I'm actually not going to read the back of the book because as much as I love this description, it says quite a bit about the premise of each story, and I kind of want people to go into each blind, but that's a good segue into what this book actually is. Arkham Anonymous is a horror anthology book with a wraparound story. And the premise of the wraparound story is a man walks into a basement and there's a bunch of people seated in a circle, and there's this big clock next to them. And each hour the clock will chime, a person will get up and will tell their story of incomprehensible horror, and then they will vanish, and there will be one less person in the room. And the guy who goes into the room has no idea what the hell is going on, and nobody will explain it to him. So it's a Lovecraft-inspired horror anthology book with the wraparound of essentially a support group. And I thought that was a really fun premise, and I thought this book was really cool in terms of the mixture of tones it brought to everything. I am not scripted for this review in any way whatsoever, so I'm just gonna go briefly over each story. Again, I started this back in December in terms of actually reading it, so my memory may not be the sharpest on each story, but I will kind of go through each one briefly and talk about what I liked, and then just talk about the book more as a whole. So the wraparound itself is really interesting. It has a really good hook to it in terms of person goes into a room, weird shit happens, nobody will explain it to him. He keeps trying to find solutions, but keeps just hitting pure dead ends, and it's very existential and cosmic horror-y in that way. You also get the sense that he's kind of a asshole and horrible person, so seeing him get frustrated about it is also entertaining in its own way. The one thing I will say about it is there's so much build-up to the character, whose name is Brad Stevens, by the way, lovely name. There's so much build-up to who he is because he's the narrator and we keep not getting his story, and it's just like, okay, this guy's obviously here because something fucked up happened to him, but what? And we kind of find that out and we kind of don't by the end, which is very cosmic horror, but also unsatisfying, which is also kind of a cosmic horror-y thing, which is just kind of, it's this very kind of surreal, existential, what the fuck just happened ending, which I think is very fitting for the whole book. But there was part of me that was just like, okay, you built this guy up enough, give us some kind of closure on what his deal is, and we don't exactly get that, which was kind of unsatisfying, but maybe that's the point. It didn't quite work for me, but I like the wraparound as a whole. The first story is called The Door. This one has a very sort of surreal dream exploration angle on the Lovecraftian cosmic horror thing happening. I enjoyed it to a degree. It's definitely one of the most simple stories in the anthology in terms of just its premise. And it's another story that doesn't really give a lot of explanation to what's going on. It didn't grab me the way some of the other stories did, but I like the premise as a whole. The Call was a fun one. I think I actually watched the movie adaptation of Dagon shortly before reading this story, and it definitely has strong vibes of Dagon slash Shadow over Innsmouth, which I think the Stuart Gordon movie mashes up those two stories, so I got a lot of that from this. The premise isn't the most original I've ever seen, but it does uh, base its cosmic horror in perfume, which is a fun angle that you don't see as often. And it's not necessarily a good or bad thing. I do find it kind of funny, though, that these very kind of grounded, ordinary, like modern day protagonists, like the main character in this, is, going on social media and looking at Facebook and yet still uses words like aeons and eldritch in narrating the story, which doesn't feel like normal modern day person thing to do. But maybe all of the characters are just, you know, secret nerds and just wouldn't admit it and actually like reading a lot of Lovecraft, which wouldn't make sense if Lovecrafty things actually exist in the universe, but I'm rambling now. And that's the other thing I do appreciate about these stories is they do take place in Lovecraft's universe, but they do not hold to Lovecraft's ideology in any way, because if you know anything about Lovecraft, you know he's a racist piece of shit. But it is fun to see these much more sort of subversive stories with much more outsidery protagonists still take place in a world where Miskatonic University exists. The horror at Sentinel Hill is a really cool one. It has a protagonist who really wants to get away from the hustle and bustle of the world and go into nature, and he's a hiker, so that fits perfectly. And it also plays into the sort of midsummery vibes of there is a cult here. It seems really idyllic, but there may or may not be something sinister lurking under the surface, and do you trust this or not? And it continues a theme that I like throughout the book, which is whereas in Lovecraft stuff, there's a lot of characters who are protagonists because they're normal people and they're detectives and they've been assigned to this task of solving some kind of mystery, which forces them to uncover these unsavory, abnormal, weird things about people who are lurking in the midst of us, which occasionally has some kind of icky implications. But the thing I like about these stories is that the characters themselves, the protagonists who are always narrating the stories from their own first person, are not always, but tend to be outsiders in some way. This guy wants to get away from the world, wants to live in nature, and his marginalizedness unfortunately makes him an easier target for the eldritch forces that lurk in the world, but it doesn't ultimately condemn him morally for being an outsider. It just shows the way that the dark forces, because this character is an outsider, target him. The next story is called Despair, and this is one of the darkest stories in the whole anthology. I mean, there's some really dark ones, especially to come. There was one that just, but I'll get to that. But this one deals with a character who is an outsider because of what appear to be mental health issues, but might be more than that. This one actually reminds me of the movie The Night House a lot, and that might be saying too much if you've seen The Night House, but if you haven't seen The Night House, you should watch The Night House because it's fucking amazing. But it is a story that deals with mental health and depression and despair and kind of a supernatural physical, maybe not physical, but a manifestation of that as a character and a presence in a way that is really unsettling, and I appreciate that. The next story is called The Other God. This is a story that probably most bluntly illustrates the point I was trying to make, because the main character is trans feminine and all of her friends are queer in some way as well. They are all confronted in a really horrific and uncomfortable way with Lovecraftian horror, specifically because they are outsiders in an uncomfortable and unfriendly place. And it does play into that fear of, what if I, as a queer person, are out in the middle of nowhere and I get attacked? But it puts a Lovecraftian twist on it, and the villains of the story, who are aligned with these Lovecraftian eldritch forces, are very blatantly bigoted. So I like that kind of complete 180 turn on some of the ideology that is baked into a lot of Lovecraft. At the same time, it's a really hard story to read, the hardest for me to read, because of what happens to these characters and the emotional turmoil they're put through, and the ending itself, which is very bleak. Just know that this one is going to be a especially tough read, particularly if you are also queer in some way. But the point made in it is very good. The next story is called The Grinning Man. This is maybe one of the simplest kind of spooky stories in the whole thing. It's not like a kid's ghost story or anything. The stakes are high. The main character's life, as per usual, is on the line. But it is a story of a character who is an outsider, because it's, this kid who nobody believes. Not a kid anymore, but still believing in this thing that nobody else knows about. But this person knows that this thing, the Grinning Man, is out to get them. And it's one of the most creepypasta-ish feeling stories in the whole thing, but that's not necessarily a knock against it. It is very creepy in its premise. It's not one that stands out abundantly in my memory compared to some of the other stories in this, but it is an entertaining, spooky little read that does get quite tense at times. The next story is The Nameless Church. This one is one that feels most sort of traditionally Lovecraftian in its setup and just story structure. It's a character who's investigating something, and in getting so caught up in and losing himself in the investigation, literally loses himself and his sanity and possibly some other things. And this one does play on some fears that hit close to home for me in terms of losing myself in a very sort of supernatural way. I don't want to say too much about that because it might spoil it, but it does play into a very specific, improbable, but unbelievably unsettling fear of mine. The next story is called Writer's Block, and it is one about a character who cannot finish a story because he has writer's block. He's a popular author, and then winds up getting a strange, unexpected visit, some new writing tools, and starts writing a very different book than the one he had planned. And it's another story of someone losing themselves in their work and their life kind of crumbling around them as a result of that. And it's one of the saddest stories in that regard, because this person is losing friends, losing family, losing touch with reality, losing memory, and is losing the ability to care at the same time because of how invested he is in finishing this book. There are also some funnier details in here that I thought were entertaining. I love that his first popular book is called Monkey Bone. Not that monkey bone, but two separate words, monkey and bone, about a killer monkey mixed with the DNA of a hammerhead shark. I'm reading that directly from the book. Also, I know for a fact that Annie is a Neil Gaiman fan, because the character who pays the struggling author a visit is Mr. Vandermeer, which, if you've read Neverwhere, which is my favorite Neil Gaiman book, Vandermeer is a character in that. And this Vandermeer and that Vandermeer are not exactly the same, but I got a lot of the same vibes, and there's kind of that sense of gentleman, but also maybe not entirely human, which I appreciate. And there's that sense where at some point in the story that the author is writing overtakes the story that you, the reader, are reading, and the line between the two become blurred, and I love it when that happens. The next story is The Hare. This is probably my favorite story in the book. I don't want to tell you exactly what the premise is, but the tone of this is very different from the other stories. It's very like Evil Dead meets Monty Python with an even worse anti-hero than either of those. But it's a character who's I think some kind of assassin, but he's sort of a bounty hunter type character. He's a piece of shit asshole who's absolutely full of himself. I wouldn't say I love him, but he's a perfect, entertaining, love to hate character, because he does horrible things and he loves every minute of it. But I love the way he's written. I love his colorful dialogue. And I love that he's kind of an arrogant piece of shit who thinks he's tougher than he actually is. And the thing that ends up taking him down is hilarious. And the premise in and of itself reminds me of a lot of things. Aforementioned Monty Python, also a segment of Tales from the Dark Side. But the payoff at the end, the little twist at the end, is perfectly like horror anthology, Tales from the Crypt, Tales from the Dark Side in a way that I was not expecting at all, but delighted me to no end when it happened. So definitely my favorite. The next story is Trotting the Boards. This one also reminds me of another familiar thing from a horror anthology. I don't know why, but it reminds me of Toby Hooper's segment from Body Bags in some ways. But it's also very much playing into someone gets absorbed in their work and loses themselves and loses touch and maybe starts becoming a little bit of a different person in some ways. But here it is mixed with one of my favorite things that can possibly happen in a story, which is characters move into a new house. House seems nice, but has something off about it. They begin investigating the offness, and it leads them down a rabbit hole towards even more weird shit about the house. And I love that it takes that trajectory. The one thing I will say about this story is the ending is weird and feels kind of off because of the way it happens. But at the same time, I kind of love it because it does tie into a prior story from the book and shows that all of these things really are taking place in the same universe. There's no real plot closure, no real proper closure that comes from that, but it is fun. And the last story is The Infernal Machine. This one, I gotta say, didn't grab me the way some others did. I like it okay, but it doesn't feel like it does a lot different from any of the other stories. It's a character who is, at studying at a university, uncovers some weird shit and starts diving deep into it. And then it starts becoming a little bit more abstract and existential the way Despair did. It's solid. I didn't dislike it. It just didn't grab me the way a lot of the other stories did. So on the whole, I'll get my main complaint with this book, and I hate to bash it because it was sent to me as a gift, and I'm not going to bash it. I like this book, but I'm going to try to give it constructive criticism because I feel like writers appreciate that. At least I hope so. But the one big thing I will say about this book is I feel like it could have done with another just read through on the whole, possibly by an editor in some way. There is nothing inherently bad about any story in this. They're all solidly written. I like the characters. I like the descriptions. But there are some just grammatical things that happen occasionally, and I can get over that easily. But it did feel like there were moments where a sentence ended twice, like Annie may have sort of thought of one way to end a sentence and written that, and then thought of a different way and then written that, and then it just didn't get edited out. Like, I can see moments where I feel like I know what was meant to be written, but there's something unnecessary there, or a sentence just isn't put together in a way that makes sense as a sentence, and I can figure out what is meant, but again, it does not take away from my enjoyment of the book in any way. It just could have done with like another passover by an editor just to make it stronger. But on the whole, I've told you what I like about all of these stories individually. I think it has a cool variety of concepts going on and a variety of tones, from really existential and bleak and hard to read to Tales from the Crypt, Sam Raimi horror comedy vibes, which is probably my favorite part of this, to be honest, but I like all of it. So If you are a horror fan in general, if you are a cosmic horror fan and you are someone who wants to see a different spin on that, I do recommend checking this book out. I am not sure where it's available for purchase, if it's widely available at all, but I will try to look into that and put some kind of a link underneath this, and I will try to link to places where you can support Annie's work as well. But that is my review of Arkham Anonymous. Thank you for watching my video, and hopefully I will see you in another one. Bye!